MacDonald. Jim is a native of North Dakota. Got his degree there and then came to the University of Nebraska. After he graduated, he spent 6 years in the Texas Panhandle in a feedlot position and is now back here in a research and teaching position at the University of Nebraska for the last 3 or 4 years. I don't remember. Doesn't matter. And he primarily focuses on growing and finishing systems and growing cattle. So Jim's going to describe sort of this change in quality and yield over time when you're around this window of harvesting.
All right. Thanks, Galen. Glad to hear that my arrival at Nebraska was such an important event in your life. It'll be 4 years in July, by the way. Great discussion this morning. I've learned a lot. Silage is not my primary emphasis in my research program, but using corn residue is. And so this seemed like a natural crossover between what we generally promote, or what I generally promote, which is the utilization of the residue, to capturing that residue before corn harvest. What we've heard so far today has primarily focused on maintaining or keeping digestible dry matter in the pile, okay? So the recommendations that we've heard: understand fermentation profiles, get bulk density correct, do a good job of packing it, use an inoculant, cover your silage pit, right? Those are all great recommendations, and all of those are intended to keep digestible dry matter in the pile, or, as Dr. Bolson said, not having it evaporate, right, fermentative losses. Dr. Charlie said something that I thought was pretty significant. He said the first dry matter loss is the most digestible, right? Yep. So that first loss of dry matter is the most digestible component that you're going to lose. My job today is a little bit different from what you've heard. It's to show you some data that we've collected to get the most digestible dry matter into the pile, okay? So talking about optimizing harvest to get the most digestible components and the greatest yield of digestible dry matter, that's probably the most important measurement that I'll share today, into the pile. I did a lot of reading, and especially a lot of reading of extension publications, and what I found is that we don't all talk in the same jargon. Okay, so recommendations of when to harvest can be based on whole plant dry matter, which means that you have to go out and cut 10 plants is what we use. Turns out that that's the general recommendation in most of the extension literature that I looked at. Chop it up, put it in an oven, and figure out what the dry matter is. Okay, so that's not the most convenient or the easiest way to look at harvest, but maybe that's the best way to look at harvest. Probably one of the most common ways is to look at percent milk line. Okay, and so we'll go through that. I'll show you one quick data slide on that. An older recommendation is to look at days past silking, and then most of what I'm going to talk about today is relative to black layer. Okay, and so the first thing that we want to do is we want to try to equilibrate all of those recommendations so that we're talking about plant maturity. Okay, so I'm a nutritionist talking about maturity of corn plants. You got to understand there's a bit of a risk there. Okay, so this is the nutritionist perspective on maturity of corn plants. However, I did find something that I thought was very useful. I believe Iowa State was the one that initially broke the stages of plant growth into vegetative stages and reproductive stages. Starting from emergence until tasseling, those are all vegetative stages. You can have like 20 or 24 different vegetative stages depending on day length. Okay, and so a take-home message that I learned from the background study is that variation in day length really affects the vegetative stage. From a nutritionist, that's good news because I can let the agronomist worry about that, right? What I'm really interested in is when we start getting into the reproductive stage. Generally, there's 3 stages in reproduction. From the time that the kernel forms as and then as black layer starts to form, which is in the R5 stage, and then black layer is in the R6 stage. Okay, and so probably all of you are familiar with a slide similar to this. This would be early in the R5 stage where you have this milk line formation that you can see right there. This is probably about 25% milk line, moving down into 50% as it moves further down into the kernel, maybe 75 or 80% milk line, and then finally you have black layer formation, which is considered the R6, the sixth reproductive stage. Okay, at that time, or at the R5 stage, the kernel moisture is at about 60%. Okay, so as a nutritionist, I think about high moisture corn harvest, right, and the series of events that a feedlot would have to go through to get things put up. R6, or black layer formation, roughly corresponds to high moisture corn harvest. Okay, so at about 35% moisture at black layer formation. So just to touch on milk line, because that's how I was taught, was to look at milk line. I think that works fine. This is silage, a relationship of silage dry matter in 4 different hybrids, okay? And as milk line moves from a 25% milk line down to a 75% milk line across all of these different hybrids, the silage would be getting drier, okay? So moving from a 30 to 35% silage at a 25% milk line up to over 40, about 40%. But what I want you to get out of this is that it's not consistent across hybrids. Okay, and so if you're only using one hybrid and use it year after year after year, that's probably fine. But if you're dealing with multiple hybrids, you can see that there's variation here at the 25% in the 4th hybrid, which would be at 30% milk layer, but almost moving up to 35% in this 1st hybrid. Same thing at 75% milk layer. You can see a pretty big variation in the whole plant dry matter at 75% milk layer. Okay, so we want to equilibrate into something that's probably a better estimate compared to milk layer. So this is a graph that I compiled from a variety of extension services, Nebraska, Iowa State, South Dakota State, Purdue, and Wisconsin, kind of put those together. The federal crop insurance is probably something that most producers are used to looking at. South Dakota State did a nice job of relating the reproductive stage to how federal crop insurance would look at the corn dent or the reproductive stage of the corn, and then the number of days that it remains, and then the days to black layer. So at R6, we're at black layer, that's at 0. Really in the R5 stage, and all of the recommendations for silage harvest would start in this R5 stage. And so one of the first things to take home is that really you're talking about probably a 2 to 3 week window to move from a very wet silage to a very dry silage. Okay, and so for some producers, that may be a challenge to get that done in a 2 to 3 week window. Versus somebody who has very large equipment, has multiple tractors on the pile, they can move in and get that done in a week to 10 days. Your recommendation on when they should begin harvesting may differ based on their situation. The other recommendation that's out there is about start harvest silage about 40 days after silk. That really targets about a 30% dry matter silage, or this very early R5 dent stage of the corn. I read really quick this morning, I read the Lallemand recommendations, and those recommendations are somewhere between 32 and 38%. So the 30% dry matter, which is an older recommendation, we're probably moving towards a drier silage across all of our recommendations. But that 40 to 42 days post-silking, but silking is still a good time to pay attention to, is really a little bit drier silage than what most recommendations would give today. Okay, so want to go through some data that's been collected here at the University of Nebraska and show you, this is the graduate student in charge of this was Dirk Birkin, but he did a nice job of showing some pictures, and so across different days, and he paid attention to hybrids and plant populations and some other things. I'm going to focus primarily on days, but went in and selected 10 representatives, staying away from the outside rows, corn plants, removed the grain so that they could get grain yield, chopped all of the non-grain components, so the forage components, through a wood chipper, weighed that. You can see there's a scale in the background there, subsampled it, took that subsample, took it back, did dry matter analysis on it, as well as some other lab assays. Okay, and so this is Dirk's data. There's 3 harvest dates here, September 1st, which he calls an early harvest date. I'm guessing that's probably about 30% dry matter silage. September 15th, 2 weeks later, we're approaching black layer at that point. And then September 29th, which is when they collected grain yield, would be corresponding to corn harvest. Okay, and so this is the yield of the corn silage. And so when is yield maximized in Dirk's data? It's on September 15th, okay, so closest to black layer formation. Percent grain continues to go up as the plant dries down, but you see from an early silage harvest to a harvest closer to black layer formation, we've increased the percent grain. NDF, there's some moves around a little bit, an increase in NDF as that plant dries down. I'll show you a couple different data sets that suggest that the NDF of the residue is declining. Okay, so I'm not sure physiologically what's going on there, but the cell solubles are probably not increasing as that plant dries down. The TDN, which he measured with a 28-hour in situ digestibility, and then assuming all of the solubles were digestible, and then with some fecal metabolic losses there. Residue TDN was also maximized closest to that black layer formation. And then the whole corn silage, so this would include the grain, was maximized actually at corn harvest primarily because of the grain, but in terms of silage harvest, that was maximized close to black layer formation. Okay, so 2 things are happening here. We're increasing the yield as we go from an early corn silage harvest to one that's closer to black layer, and we're increasing the concentration of nutrients, or the TDN, both in the residue. We're increasing corn, and so our capture of total digestible nutrients increases as we get closer to black layer formation. This is a similar type of study. This is a 2-year study summarized by Cassandra Rowe, where she started measuring 4 weeks prior to black layer, very similar to the process that I showed you. Took samples, separated them into forage components and grain components, measured silage yield, and this is both silage yield and silage dry matter. Okay, so just showing that you're going from a low 30, 32, 33% dry matter silage about 3 weeks prior to black layer formation. Dry matter is increasing fairly rapidly. She was at 42% dry matter. 42 is kind of important because I'm going to come back to that later. At black layer formation, and then the plant continues to dry down. This is silage yield, and just to be clear, because I don't have it on there, this is tons of dry matter, okay, not tons as is in the field. Yield was also maximized at black layer formation. I wanted to put these 2 on the same graph, but it kind of underrepresents the change here. Okay, so a 2-week delay in corn silage harvest resulted in an 18% increase in yield. It's a fairly substantial increase in yield due to a 2-week delay in harvest. Okay, so this is corn yield. Probably the hole in this data set is corn yield is increasing through black layer. She's did some hand harvest and showed a decline there. Typically, we'd expect that to stay relatively flat, but as you would expect, the percent grain, as Dirk also saw, increases through black layer formation, and then here as the plant is drying down. Okay, so this is NDF contents and then cell solubles. Cell solubles are presumably 100% digestible or 98% digestible. Okay, so the lowest component of NDF, again, it's declining here at least a week prior to black layer formation, and so cell solubles are maximized about a week before black layer formation in Cassandra's data set. Okay, so I said digestible dry matter and digestibility of the NDF were 2 very important components to optimizing silage harvest time. Both of those were generally optimized or maximized about a week prior to black layer formation. Okay, and so where the old recommendations were out here at 30% dry matter, as corn hybrids have changed, the capture of those nutrients are probably greatest as we move closer about a week prior to black layer formation or closer to black layer formation. So this is the change in the whole plant digestible. This slide was just of the stover. This includes the grain, and so if you include the grain on top of the stover, the digestible dry matter is maximized at black layer formation. Okay, and so this is the change in yield of digestible dry matter. Again, that is maximized at black layer formation, but we see a pretty strong increase if we get about a week prior to or at black layer formation. Okay, so there's 3 years worth of data that I've shared with you quickly that shows the closer you get to black layer, you get more yield, and you get an improvement in the total digestible nutrients that are captured in that yield. Just to show you, and I apologize, this is Pioneer's data, but Fred Owens did a very similar type thing, looking at NDF digestibility, basically not changing, a slight decline in NDF digestibility, but a strong increase in starch content as the proportion of grain increases. Also showed, this is another data set where we see a decrease in the NDF content as you move to 40% dry matter silage. 40% dry matter silage should be fairly close to black layer formation, to put this in perspective of the data that I've already shared with you. Okay, and so if we're going to go through the effort to go out and harvest some plants, get a representative sample, do a dry matter, a rule of thumb that's fairly handy is that there's a decrease of 1/2 to 1 unit of moisture per day, and then Dr. Owens also says an increase of 0.5 to 1 points of starch per day as the plant is drying down. So that's a handy piece of information if you have a point in time when you're doing a dry matter on the silage to kind of project when you want to target your harvest. Okay, so as I said it initially, my primary interest is in the residue component, and so I can't give a talk without talking about differences in the corn plant parts. Okay, and so it's important to remember that the husk and the leaf are the most digestible components, but they're also in the smallest proportion. The stem, which is about 50% of the plant, is not very digestible, and so this is some in vitro digestibility just to support that. You can see that the husk and the leaf are very high in digestibility, as well as the shank, and then if you get up here into the stem, the digestibility of those components are much lower. Okay, so this is Mandy Jones. Mandy did a similar study to what Cassandra and Dirk did, but she was interested in the residue component. So she separated each of those components of the plant, weighed them, and did some digestibility work with them. But the reason that I'm showing her data today is that she started collecting samples prior to black layer, which is what the 0 intercept is here. And then she put an arrow at the 15.5% moisture, which would be presumably about grain harvest. Okay, so she's got a couple of data points here before we get into black layer, and this is NDF content, how the plant is changing over time. NDF content of the husk and the blade and the cob are all increasing over time. Interestingly, and this is what if there's a plant physiologist that can explain this to me, it would be great. Remember we said that we see a decline in NDF content of the silage through time. Mandy's data would suggest that decline in NDF content is in the stem. So I have a hard time thinking that the stem is increasing in the amount of cell solubles. Nevertheless, except for the stem, NDF content is increasing as you go through time. This is the digestibility. It looks like the digestibility is increasing here. Statistically, these are all flat lines. Okay, so the first thing to point out is the digestibility of the NDF in the stem. And again, this is 28-hour in situ digestibility, is pretty close to 0, right? The stem is very lowly digestible. The cob is the only one that's significantly decreasing. So Terry did a lot of work with corn cobs at one point in his career. Those were seed corn cobs, okay, and so the digestibility of those were probably out here somewhere, but we see that decreases through time. Okay, so this puts together, and I know this is a bit messy, but this puts together true digestibility, which is a combination of the solubles, or the neutral detergent soluble component, and then the digestibility of the NDF. And you can see that the stem appears to be increasing. Again, I have a little bit of a hard time with that. Really no change, a slight decrease in the blade and sheath. The husk is not changing statistically, but we also see a reduction in the digestibility of the cob. So the individual components are also changing as the plant matures. Okay, last thing then before we get to the panel is we've done some animal performance studies. Don't tell Galen I showed this to you, because I think his plan is to show you the animal performance studies, but it'll be okay because it fits in nicely with the talk. Henry Hilscher harvested silage at 37% dry matter, so 2 weeks prior to black layer, and 43%. Remember I said Cassandra's black layer dry matter was 42%, and I was going to come back to that. That's because Henry harvested at approximately black layer and had 43% dry matter silage. So I got to point out that this is not a 30 or 33% dry matter silage compared to a silage harvested at black layer. Both of these are probably drier than what the average silage that's harvested out there is. Okay, so this is growing steer performance. So if everything that I've told you is true, we should see an improvement in performance. So what happened? 5-weight, 6-weight calves, those consuming 88% silage, it's 43% dry matter, no change in dry matter intake. They were lighter, they gained less, and they were less efficient. Okay, so they did exactly opposite of what we would have predicted based on everything that I told you. Why? Well, it's 88% of the dry matter, and we've increased the concentration of the starch in the diet. We know that starch negatively impacts fiber digestion, and we're at about 50% corn and 50% forage in that silage, and so we've probably reduced fiber digestibility in a growing diet. Okay, this is the finishing diet then. So 37% versus 43% dry matter silage. Again, no difference in dry matter intake, no difference in average daily gain, no difference in feed efficiency, no difference in hot carcass weight. You can go on down the line. There was absolutely no difference. And Galen, I think, will go into this, but this was fed at 15 and 45% of the diet. This is the main effect of silage dry matter, but there was no effect of silage dry matter as you move from 37 to 43%. Okay, so I can't make a strong argument that the quality of the silage has increased from 37 to 43%, but we do know that the yield has increased. So our general recommendation now is to target this 37% dry matter silage based on those data. I tell students that my job title is systems, which is great because it means I can do anything I want to as long as I call it a system. But really that means that I'm supposed to look at things from different perspectives. So there's a couple of other considerations here. The silage that Henry put up was stored in an ag bag. Most people will probably store in a bunker. Okay, and so what does drier silage mean in terms of harvesting bulk or getting bulk density and doing a good job of packing, which we've already heard is really important. We don't have those data. And because I don't want to sound like I'm being hypocritical, the next time you hear me speak, I may talk about double crop annual forages or coming in following silage with a cover crop and then grazing that cover crop. It's a really nice system that we're collecting data on. So you can see here's corn that's been harvested for high moisture corn. Here's corn that's been harvested for silage. We come back in with oats after that, and then we're able to graze those oats. Works fairly nicely, and it's competitive. This is Kristen Ulmer's data, but I only want to go down here. If you compare grazing residue with distiller's grain supplementation to target the same average daily gain as what we would target with the oats, the cost of gain is competitive. Okay, so we think that this is a reasonable system to come in with a secondary forage crop after silage harvest, get the benefits of the agronomic benefits of the cover crop, and then graze that crop. Here's the challenge, is that we're running out of growing degree units. So this was put together by Mary Dranowski and Darren Redfern, but you can see if you delay corn harvest, corn silage, you're going to be running out of growing degree units if you're in a system that wants to come in with a secondary forage crop. Right? So there's more than one consideration other than just harvest yield that we need to consider. Nevertheless, these data are fairly clear that you'll get an increase in yield and an increase in digestibility at presumably up to 37%. We probably need to go back and do a comparison of silage that was harvested at 33% and 37% dry matter to confirm that. I'll let you read the conclusions in the paper that I provided. Galen?
Other questions for Jim?
Where do you typically harvest prior to this work? Are you closer to 30?
Repeat the question.
The question was, where do we typically harvest prior to doing this work? Probably closer to 35% dry matter.
Go ahead and use that one, battery's running on that one, I think.
I would repeat that.
Okay, so our question was, what was the typical dry matter harvest that we targeted prior to doing this work? Typically, some starting at 33, but at 33 to 35% dry matter is probably the typical harvest for us prior to this.
Jim, did you measure the fermentation profile on those two silage and dry matter silages and the lactic acid, propionic acid?
The question was, did we measure fermentation profiles? I believe Galen is going to cover some of that in his talk. He's done some fermentation profile work. Did you do that yesterday? Yeah, so I'm going to leave that for Galen.
I was hoping that, so otherwise I won't have much to talk about this afternoon. No, it's fair. Yeah, we will discuss it some. Other questions? Eric?
How much variation was there within those dry matter levels or in 37% dry matter, what variation was there?
Yeah.
Repeat it
What
again.
was the variation in dry matter within our 37 and 42% dry matter silage? That was harvested in a fairly short window. They would have done, Galen, you have that number in the top of your head?
Henry Hill sure does, but I don't on top of my head. That 37 and 43 is based on our oven dry matters from weekly samples. Now I'm worried about how we're sampling our bunkers after Keith's presentation, but we take samples weekly, and that was the overall average for the whole feeding trial. It does get a little wetter after fermentation. So that's not harvested dry matter. It's actually fed dry matter. But 60-degree forced air oven dry matter. Questions for Jim? Since I'm enjoying answering them? No. Yes, sir.
Do we, and what percent dry matter do we have total pack salad?
That's certainly a good one for you.
I'll repeat the question, but I won't answer it. The question was, at what percent dry matter do we start to have trouble getting it packed well, right? I don't know. We spent quite a bit of time talking about how do you get to those data, and we feel like it takes big bunkers and a lot of replicated big bunkers to be able to get at that data. In general, the recommendation is the drier that you harvest, if you're using an ag bag system, which is that's why I pointed that out, that's how this silage was stored, you can store drier silage compared to one that is packed in a bunker. I'm open to input from others on where that line was, but I don't have it.
There's actually a fair amount of literature out there in the dairy side as well, but I'm always a little worried about replicated bunkers similar to what Keith had shown that are of size and nature to replicate what you would see in a bunker in an operation. It's tough work that we're not doing here at the University of Nebraska. Steve?
What research has been done in regards to silage harvest with kill or drought?
The question is research that's been done with drought or hail corn?
I'm going to mention it briefly in my talk, that it is a good management option for hailed out and drought damaged corn, and very limited studies. And so Mater's out in the hall talking, but he's got some comparisons. So maybe if we can, maybe wait till we get to that. That's mostly with drought damaged corn, lower in grain, and it changes the energy value. But it does in sow. Okay, I said no questions, and then there was a flurry, which is great. Okay, that means we're on a good trend. Thanks. Let's thank Jim.